But I know that my rose would never consent to have that sweet name taken away.
Well, I guess what it means to me is, and I never really associated it until I went to Ireland the first time, and there's just something when you go there that the feeling of being there kind of just cements that that's where your roots are, and it's quite a settling feeling, I think.
It was instilled in my father to be proud of this country, and they looked ahead. They didn't look back. Looking back was too traumatic, too painful. They looked ahead.
My name is Johanna Prindiville. My maiden name was Scanlon. I was born in a place called Ballydorgan in County Cork, Ireland.
My family basically has three branches that came from Ireland. The Evans family, which is our Welsh Anglo-Irish ancestry, came over in 1698, which is quite a while ago.
The Gathering, Collected Oral Histories of the Irish in Montana, is a long-term interdisciplinary oral history project which seeks to record and to archive the Irish and Irish Montanan folk histories, performances, practices and traditions.
He talked very little about it, and I'm really sorry today that I didn't pursue questioning him more on his childhood. I tried to think of what area was like where he grew up, and he never talked about it.
Well, of course, the memories are really more of childhood than of Dublin. I mean, it took me a little while to be aware of where I was, what country, what city, but growing up in Dublin was probably very like growing up almost anywhere else. It's a small city, but very cosmopolitan. We had everything there, everything that we needed. And I think one early on became aware of being Irish because Ireland had been occupied for 700 years by the British by the time I was growing up.
What do you know about your father and mother's lives in Ireland, what they did, what their families did?
They grew up in a small village called Danette. It's in County Clare along the Shannon River. When I remember as a kid going there, they still had like the slate floors, you know, and they didn't have the hearth. My father's home still had the hearth when I went there, and they cooked on the hearth. But my mother had like the stove that they cooked with the turf in and everything.
One of the, again, things that I remember was all of the holidays, everybody got together and there was always something Irish, or, I mean, it didn't matter if it was Thanksgiving or Christmas or anything else. It had an Irish theme. And of course, on St. Patrick's Day, I never ever remember going to school. I never went to school. My mother would not allow us to go to school on St. Patrick's Day. It was a holiday. And unfortunately, before she passed away, she passed that on to my children, and then I had to be beholden to them too, so they never went to school on St. Patrick's Day.
Went by the name of Joan for a number of years, but when I entered university, they wouldn't accept an alias. So I went back to becoming Johanna. In Ireland, while in school at least, we spoke Irish only on school grounds when I was a youngster. Interestingly, when my father was a youngster, they were not allowed to speak Irish. So my name at that time was Siobhan, or Siobhan ní Scanlon.
My name is Elizabeth McNamer, and I was born in Capawhite, County Tipperary, Ireland, in December of 1936. I grew up in Capawhite till I was 11 years old, and then I went to boarding school in England, a place called Lowestoft in Suffolk, which accounts for my accent.
And the boarding house would make their lunch, and they had very good food, family style at these boarding houses, big tables set out, and then they had bucket girls made the buckets, and they'd have a really good lunch going to work.
So what exactly was a bucket girl?
she made the lunch bucket. They called it the lunch bucket, and then they'd have their sandwiches and fruit and cookies, and probably if you were a favorite, you might get an extra cookie.
I grew up in the Depression time, and I remember it was very difficult for people to get loans at the bank, and so many people would come to Papa and ask if he would sign a note so they could get money to exist on, and he was glad to do that. He never gave what he could spare. He always gave what was needed.
My great-grandfather could read and write, which I think was pretty unusual. They spoke English, which was also unusual for a lot of them. And I'm thinking that at the time his family probably worked for the English. That's why I think they maybe survived the famine, because I know a lot of people in Roscommon didn't. They lost about half of their population, either through immigration or the famine.
Yeah, and they still had a real tough time. But they, just like in New York, they became firemen, mailmen, teachers, and they worked hard. They didn't expect anything.
Since spring 2010, I've travelled across Montana, giving workshops, meeting volunteers, and recording interviews. I've worked with students on this material, and they have created songs, short film vignettes, monologues, performances, short stories, and academic research papers, all using the gathering as their source material.
You know, it's an interesting thing, and every generation is probably slightly different, but I don't think this part is different. I think a lot of it was faith-based. And, you know, going through Catholic schools at the time in Montana, there were more in Montana at the time in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And we understood about sticking together as a family, sticking together with our cousins and our aunts and uncles. And that's still prevalent to this day. And I still think that has a lot to do with how the Irish stayed together, not only in Butte and Anaconda and Missoula, but in Billings and Kalispell and Helena. I mean, they always stuck together because of the faith base and how we grew up in Catholic schools.
The average day of running around in Butte with Sam, it was one of those deals where maybe nothing's average, but of course nobody drank the water because it was all poison. So my aunt would always give us we'd have a supply of Mountain Dew, so we'd have a lot of caffeine and sugar, and then we would just run around and play. We'd play in the mines, we'd run all over and climb on stuff. There was always, you know, there was quite a bit of things to get into in Butte.
Where I was raised, you know, that was, if you were an Irishman, you were, even in the army, a lot of them would call you Irish or something, you know, and I would want to keep the heritage really alive.
The stories we have collected so far are remarkable. Stories of miners, mothers, ranchers, politicians, people who raised large families on barely anything at all, people who changed laws, educated, nursed, brawled, made fortunes and lost them.
Went out to the old homestead where my father was raised, which was a rock stone house that was broken down in shambles now, but at least I could see where he grew up, and I was impressed because it was on a beautiful piece of ground on a side of what they call mountains there, but they'd be large hills here, but they didn't have crops, they had mostly cattle or sheep.
Oh yes, there were some pretty tough men up there, and they never were inclined to have any trouble, but if it come to them, they could take care of themselves.
He was working in the mines and he was injured, and they decided to come to Missoula and start a new life. They arrived in Missoula with a wagon, a horse, and I think a couple cows and 2 small children. And they settled in a little log cabin on the edge of Missoula.
Ed would come and get us in a sleigh with a team of horses. Wow. And then we could go across the fields to get home. And they used to throw me off the hay wagon, and I was feeling really bad and unloved. And the reality is they were keeping me alive. because then I would be running and energizing and staying warm.
It was a really tight-knit community, but it was open at the same time. You were free to come and go, and they were very sociable with each other.
Mike Quinn, Paul Smith, George Dawson, Nifty Dawson.
Nifty.
Yeah. They're, you know, they all were just fine gentlemen that really made an impact on the community. There also were a lot of young men who came from Ireland and worked for people, never married. Mm-hmm. They, when years were really tough, they worked for their board and room and for a little tobacco and a bottle now and then, and they just became a member of the family. They're buried in the little church in the cemetery there, and their graves are still marked. We've tried to research, so at least their graves are marked. They don't have stones.
Yeah.
But the diagram shows where they're all married. What, Jack Walsh and
Johnny Walsh.
Or Johnny Walsh.
There's a lot of pride in being Irish, as there is a lot of pride for Italians to be Italian, Germans to be German, Swedes to be Swedes, Norwegians to be Norwegians. I think if you're fortunate enough to have enough of a nation, a country's blood in your background, and it's been foisted upon you, or you've had a chance to learn a little bit about it, there's an interest there if you take it, and if you want to pursue it. That, to me, is something to have some pride in. I mean, we're all mongrels. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We're all mongrels to a very large degree, but if you can break out the thoroughbred a little bit and put your money on that, then why not?
To date, the gathering has collected over 140 audio interviews, 40 of these also on film, and has received significant donations of film, papers and other materials. My thanks to all who have welcomed us into their homes and lives and told us their stories.
And he had a terrible influence on me in that he made me join the Hibernian. He didn't make me, but he was always going to these Hibernian meetings and coming home real happy. And I thought, that's a good way to live when you're teaching kids. You know, that's a good way to. On Wednesday, you don't have to wait till Friday night or Saturday to come.
They love to exaggerate, they love a good story, and they love a good party.
Around, you know, they'll say the same thing, well, you Irish have a great time. Well, we do. There's no doubt about it.
My full name is Danette Marie Harrington.
Jeremiah John Downey. James Edward Gillespie.
My name is Joe Reber.
This is Patrick Cook.
I go by Tom, and I'll tell you the reason for that as the interview progresses.
This is Maureen Edwards and
Mary Frances Flynn McQuade.
My name is Margaret Louise Harris.
Bernadette Sweeney.
And Shirley Wales.
This is Clint Shea, and I'm going to interview Tom MacIntyre.
Donald Edward McCarthy.
Saying I'm Jim Mackin.
Mary Catherine Downey.
My name is Joan Porter.
I come from the county Carey. I'm a typical Irishman. There's Sullivan, Minahan, Minahan, Pat Brennan, and O'Keefe. Some came from Dingle and McGillicuddy's Reef. Tony Shea O'Connor, two in the mighty breast Nahan. Everyone from Carey and the typical Irishman.
Sounds about right, yeah.